Hello everybody, I'm Harriet Mishkin and I'm delighted to be teaching this course for you. This is Strategic Planning in the Nonprofit Jewish Community, and it is one of my favorite courses. Let me start by giving you a little bit of background about myself, and then I'm going to give you an overview of the course and then begin your first lecture. I'm new at this, never made a YouTube video nor gave a lecture where I was talking to a screen and nobody was there to react. So hopefully you are laughing and smiling back at me, and I will try to do the same for you. I've worked in nonprofit management most of my career, and only in the last 20 years did I tip my toe into the for-profit world. Interestingly, I found that most organizations have the same issues, particularly as they're related to human resources management, where I really spent most of my time. So I began my career as a social worker. I'm located in Philadelphia, and began once I became a consultant working with a lot of the Jewish organizations in Philadelphia, helping them to develop their strategic plans and also working in management and leadership development. I taught at the University of Pennsylvania in what was then the School of Social Work, and now it's called SP2, Social Policy and Practice, for 15 years as an adjunct lecturer. And there I worked with social work students around leading and managing and administering in nonprofit agencies, while at the same time I worked with many agencies as a consultant. So in this new venture, I'm looking for ways to interact with you that are more lively rather than just paper lectures, because like you, we can fall asleep, nod off, be bored, all of those things. So today is a lecture, and in session 2 we're going to do some PowerPoint slides with my voiceover, and there'll be some paper lectures, hard copies you can download. And I'm toying with the idea, since most of you are located in the Philadelphia area, of doing one live in-class grad college presentation. And we're going to see whether or not that works, and how we then can get others involved who may not be in the Philadelphia area. So what I like to say in my first class, whether it's online or alive, is that I'm here for you, and you need to tell me what isn't working as well as what is working, and not wait until the last class, because there's no way that I can change anything when we are no longer seeing one another. I also am not that smart that I can do everything by memory, so if you see me glance down, I have papers and references, and I will be looking at them from time to time. So my eye will leave the camera as I glance at my own materials. So that's a little bit about me, and you will be able to go to your first forum and introduce yourself. So let's now take a look at the course that I've designed for you in strategic planning. Each week will be a reading assignment, a lecture, and a forum. There will be 3 short papers, each due at session 1 due at session 4, 1 due in session 6, and 1 due in session 11. And there will be a final case study due at the end. More on that as we get closer to the end. And as I mentioned earlier, some of our classes will be paper lectures, some will be YouTube, and some will be PowerPoint with some audio. Please let me know what you find the most effective, and I will see whether or not I can customize that to meet your needs. Let's start by looking at the importance of strategic planning. This is one of my favorite activities. Why? Because it gives organizations a chance to stop and look at what they're doing. Stop, look, listen, reflect. In the early days of in the nonprofit world, we really didn't do it. We did same old, same old. And at the end, when we had to evaluate what we had been doing, we really never knew where we wanted to go. We just did things in the same way. And only when a crisis hit did we think about doing things differently. Strategic planning is, in fact, the structured process which is designed to give direction and continuity to organizations so that your results can change if times require it. And those of us who are up to date and astute about world economics know that we've reached that point now in organizations where we need to stop, look, listen, and reflect and do things differently. Another reason why I really like strategic planning, it gives stakeholders the opportunity to get involved in improving programs and services. Now, when you go to your reading material, you will find a glossary of key terms in strategic planning, and one of them will define stakeholders. But just what are stakeholders for our purposes right now? It's anyone who has a stake in the outcome of the programs and services. In agencies, we're talking about staff, we're talking about board members, we're talking about clients or consumers, whatever you call them. We talk about donors, we talk about funders. Sometimes even vendors are involved. And in some agencies, we're really talking about neighbors. Because in one strategic plan I did for a local Jewish agency, they were building group homes in communities. And neighbors clearly are stakeholders because they are concerned about who will live there, how will they live there, what will happen if there is turnover in staff, who are the staff, etc. So stakeholders form a wide variety of people who have a stake in the outcome. In synagogues, for example, the stakeholders also include your clergy, which are staff, your board, and then of course your members, who are the families, who pay their yearly annual fees and Hebrew school tuitions and member fees. Every one of those has a stake in the outcome. So I think you get the picture. Stakeholders are individuals and groups that are impacted or in fact affected by the activities of the organization and its ability to fulfill its vision and mission. Again, these are words that we will discuss and define as we go into the program. By the way, when I did reference the glossary of terms, I do recommend that you print it out and keep it for reference as we go through the class. Many of the readings might be good references for you also. Here's a third reason why I really love strategic planning. It gives organizations an opportunity to do things differently, or more of, or less of, or more of the same. The key to the saying is if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Now, grammar aside, the idea is that you cannot continue to do things in the same way because you may continue to get the same results and they may not be the results that you need. According to Bryson, which is the text you are using, that strategic planning is defined as simply a set of concepts, procedures, and tools designed to help executives, managers, and others to think, act, and learn strategically on behalf of their organizations and their organizations' stakeholders. Okay, so we have defined strategic planning. But what does it mean to be strategic? Does it mean that all areas of an organization make their decision to lead toward the same outcome or goal? Does it mean that planning and predicting the future and coming up with plans for the future? Is that what it means? Here's what it means to me. A good strategic plan is, and being strategic means, reflecting on the values of an organization. Are we doing what we need to do to live out our organization values? And by the way, begin thinking now, what are my organization's values? And if right now I'm not working in an organization, can I think of an organization where I did work or I do belong to? Do they have articulated values? And do they make decisions based on their values? What else does being strategic mean? It does mean being clear about your organization's direction, it in relation to its mission, its vision, and its values, and yet it must acknowledge that it is part of a larger dynamic environment that has to change with the times. So a strategic plan gives organizations that opportunity to be strategic, to inspire action, to achieve a bigger future. It explains how the organization will serve its marketplace, its consumers, or its clients, or its families, or its members. And then it looks at what are the criteria for achieving the results. And we have to use some metrics. What do we want to accomplish? How do we want to accomplish it? How do we know when we're getting there? What are those milestones? And how do we know when we've achieved that end result, our outcomes? So there's a lot of measurement involved. I remember in my early days as a social worker, we never had goals to begin with, and therefore if we were evaluated at the end, how did we know we did a good job? There were no benchmarks that we had to achieve. So that has changed in the last 20 plus years. Organizations are really looking at benchmarks and milestones and measurable outcomes, and that's what strategic plan can offer. And yet, in order for a strategic plan to be effective, it has to have day-to-day decision-making or tactics that help us reach that focus and that direction that we've agreed to. Again, moving from our plan to an action steps. And lots of plans get stuck. They can plan and they can plan and they can plan, but they forget the importance of taking action. On the other hand, there are a lot of organizations that take action without planning. Strategic planning means having both a plan and an action plan so that you can get there. Now let's take a look at some time frames. There are two kinds of time frames in strategic planning. Strategic planning takes a long time to decide whether or not it wants to engage in a strategic plan. I call that pre-work or planning to plan. You have to decide in the first time frame who is going to be involved in this strategic plan. Is it board? Is it staff? Just who are the stakeholders? How long is the process going to take? Do we want to spend 3 months doing this, 6 months doing this, a year doing this? What kind of data is required and who's going to collect it? What kind of structure do we need to organize and govern or oversee how the plan is doing? And are we going to use an internal process or an external process to do this? By that I'm referring to, do we have someone inside who is going to lead and manage this process, or are we going to hire an outside facilitator? So in my experience, I've always been that outside facilitator that gets hired to help with the pre-work and then get the group organized and then into action, and then we monitor and we follow up. So that's one kind of time frame. The second kind of time frame you have to decide is, do we want a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan? Now, on the outset, you would think, geez, this takes so much time and money, let's opt for a 5-year plan. But in an environment that is not stable like today, where the environment can be chaotic, where funding can be questioned, having a 5-year plan is much too far out. And sometimes even having a 3-year plan can get you into trouble. Now here's an example. One organization that I've worked with for over 15 years decided to create a 3-year plan. In the past they had been very stabilized. Their income was steady. Their growth was continuous and ongoing, and then hit the financial crisis beginning in '08, '09, '10, and finally the impact in the government. I mean, that really started in the for-profit market, and then all of a sudden in the nonprofit market in 11 and 12, fiscal years 11 and 12, all of a sudden government cutbacks began to impact a lot of the nonprofits. Services were cut back, layoffs occurred, and all of a sudden the 3-year plan was no longer viable. So what does an organization do? Well, they have to look at their plan and decide what has to change, what is no longer viable. So another word to describe strategic plans is that they're dynamic. They can't be static. They can't be made in cement. They have to be fluid, because the life of our environment, of our organization, has to change with the times. So in order to be successful, you have to change, and you do that by continually monitoring your plan, monitoring your environment, and making changes when necessary. So to sum up what we've just talked about, there are 2 time frames. One time frame looks at how long do we want this strategic planning process to take? Do we want to work a year? And by the way, the year is the norm. 6 months to a year is the norm. And the variable is, it depends on the resources of the organization, who's doing it. Small organizations sometimes use an outside facilitator and 1 or 2 members of the staff. They can't afford to lose anymore, maybe 1 or 2 board members. And so their time frames and their outcomes are more have a shorter planning cycle, whereas larger organizations can take up to a year to organize, plan, create a timetable, and then begin rolling out after the first year. So we've now talked about a couple different things. What do we mean by strategic? What is a strategic plan? What can the strategic plan accomplish for an organization? What are our time frames? And now we're ready to look at the phases of a strategic plan. Now, before I go on, there's a thought that gets confused in a lot of people's minds. One is long-term planning versus strategic planning. What is the difference? Well, in strategic planning, we're really looking at a very detailed process that's going to look at critical success factors, clarify policies, look at internal processes, external processes, internal guidelines for monitoring, implementation plans, etc. Whereas long-term plans really take your strategic plan and break it down into what are we going to do in year 1, what are we going to do in year 2, what are we going to do in year 3. So once again, while long-term plans and strategic plans are closely related, the former long-term plans set goals and objectives, whereas the strategic plan defines the organization's mission and all the factors that will impact the future, the strategic future of the organization. So that's just to avoid some confusion on the difference between the 2. So let's now take a look at the phases. I've taught this and led this where there can be 5 phases, and each one of them has lesser parts. But for our purposes today, we're going to take a look at 3 phases, and in your readings you may be referred to 3 phases or 5 phases. They all encompass all of the same things. It's just a better way for me to organize this for you. So what's phase one? Phase one is really that pre-planning that I talked about. Do we really want to do this? Who should be involved? Do we have the money? What do our funders think about this process? And in one organization I worked with, one of the funders wanted it so badly that they underwrote the funding of the entire strategic plan. And that's not uncommon. I have seen that in larger organizations, and sometimes even in small organizations who have a really important mission. Some funders might take to underwrite it so that underwrite the strategic plan so that they're getting more for their money and more strategically. So phase one has that pre-planning, that planning, and their organizing. And typically this can take 1 to 3 months. And we will spend more time on that in session 2 when we talk about how hard it is to form groups and teams and manage that as part of the strategic plan, because it does require a lot of organizing around group work, team norms, etc. So more to come in session 2. Phase 2 is implementing. Now, as easy as that sounds, it can get complicated. We're going to talk more about implementing as we get well into the course. My notes say not until session 10 because we have so much to do between sessions 1 and 9. When we get to implementing, what we're talking about is whether or not we are going to roll out everything all at once. That is what is sometimes called big bite, organization-wide, transformational change. Wow. That's a lot of words to describe what organizations might do to completely change everything and impact all its people, its clients, its staff, and all of its stakeholders. Everything happens at once. That can be rather dangerous, but it really depends on what's going on in the organization and whether such big bite change is really necessary. More suitable to organizational life today and probably on our stress and nerves is what we call incremental change. Now, an incremental change sometimes begins with a pilot. Maybe there is a need to change the way marketing is conducted or outreach in order to gain more clients or consumers or members for your organization. Instead of doing it all at once, maybe you try a pilot it with one group of residents or neighbors or members to see whether or not it will work and whether or not there is resistance and whether there are glitches so you can change it. So that pilot is part of what we call an incremental change strategy. That is probably what I would recommend more often. Again, it depends on whether or not the organization is in crisis and whether big bite is really required or whether or not incremental will do the job. So that whole process can take 3 to 6 months, maybe even a year, because you really want to roll it out slowly, measure the results, make your tweaks to your plan, and then roll it out to the rest of the organization. Now that leads us to phase 3, which of course is monitoring and following the mass rollout. This constantly needs to be monitored. If you have a 3-year plan, you're going to monitor it minimally every 6 months. We want to make sure that what we said we want to achieve at our milestones are actually happening. Those benchmarks have to be met early on, otherwise you may reach the end of year 1 and not where you want to be. And does that require changes in the plan or changes in the way it got implemented? So monitoring and tracking and follow-up is phase 3. And when there is an outside consultant, that consultant generally will stay around in a lesser relationship, playing a role in monitoring and tracking to help the organization stay in business. In this organization that I mentioned to you, the one in which many changes occurred in the middle of their 3-year plan because finances were really cut back tremendously, they continued to monitor and track. However, they used internal staff to do that. And that raises another issue. Do you have staff that are capable, have the time? Do you have to take away something from another role that they play in the organization in order for them to do so? So decisions are not cut and dry. They're always made within the context of what's going on. Now, here's an important point, and I'm not sure that this is clearly understood in a lot of strategic plans, that often management systems need to change for implementation to be successful. So once a strategic plan is complete and before a pilot or rollout, the systems need to be in place that support the changes and the agreed upon strategies. Some of the basics of these systems that need to be put in place. The first one basically that we're all familiar with is the organization chart. Who reports to who is accountable to who, and what are the staff assignments, and do they make sense on the organization chart? Because the old organization chart may not work under a new strategic plan. Another basic of this strategic management system is how much training has to occur for the strategic planning to be implemented. Do people have the skills and the techniques that they need that are now required under the strategic plan? If you're changing the way services are delivered, if you are changing the services themselves, do you have the right people in place? Do they have the right supervision? Do they need additional training? And is that classroom training? Is that on-the-job training? Is that all distance learning training? Just exactly what kind of training is needed. And that's frequently where I have stepped in to play a role once the strategic plan is different. Another basic of this new strategic management system are communication channels and activities. How do you articulate what the vision is of the changes in the strategic plan? How do you, particularly in a big organization, go around and let people know what the changes are, why they are coming, their role in making it successful, and how leadership is open to hearing what the issues are? That is critical. And leaders, and we'll talk a lot later about what leaders need to be and do during strategic plans, having those communication channels open. And it's not just email, and it's not just Skyping. In organizations that are local with branches within the same city, it means getting out there and seeing people face to face, because there's nothing like face-to-face interactions. All our other techniques are really very important. We honor and respect the technology advances that will allow us to reach more people faster, certainly cheaper, sometimes not always better. And lastly, to build this strategic management system, I said we needed an organizational chart, we needed better training programs, we need better communication channels, and we need a team that will, or an oversight team or committee that will monitor, track, and follow up, and then lastly, evaluate. So those four kinds of structures need to be put in place to create a management system that will support the strategic plan. Now, let's not underestimate the need to have some money to do this. And one of the things that you have to decide in the pre-work is how much money will it take, and do we have it? Will you have an external consultant? What will that cost, and can we afford it? Do we have a funder who is interested enough to underwrite this? In large organizations, the consultant works closely and processes the work and facilitates the work of the team, the strategic planning team, and in smaller organizations may in fact do a lot more hands-on because there's not enough staff. And that was my experience with a small local Jewish organization. They had very little staff. They had a board that didn't have tremendous skills, and but they had some interest. And so between the consultant and some key members of staff and board, we were able to write the strategic plan and do all the data collection. What's a budget look like? Well, I would say, in my experience, the least you can spend is 20,000, and then it goes up. And the most I know one group just spent was 50. So we're talking about budgeting and understanding where we have the money to do this. And if you don't have the money, there's still out-of-pocket costs, and there's still time costs. So organizations have to think very long and very clear whether or not their budget will allow them to do this. And if they do it internally, they look at their administrative and overhead budgets and see whether or not some things can be maneuvered to allow to cover some basic costs. So here we are at the end of my probably very verbose and hopefully clear first lecture. I hope that I articulated it well enough for you to understand the different points, that my overview was comprehensive as well as comprehensible. Please let me know otherwise. So now it's your turn. Enter into Form 1A and introduce yourself. There are instructions there about what I'd like to know. And then go to Form 1B, which gives you your first reading assignment, which is based on your text, the Bryson text, where you will read 3 case studies, and I've picked out some basic questions for you to look at. I look forward to talking with you again. Welcome to the class on strategic planning. Bye for now. Okie doke. You'll pardon me if you're still looking. I'm trying to figure out how to stop this. I'm pushing the stop button, but it doesn't want to go. Okay. It says stop recording.